Here's a typical matchstick or toothpick puzzle, and I had somebody ask me how they could use the Geometer's Sketchpad to create some matchsticks or toothpicks in order to be able to manipulate them and work on these puzzles on a computer. So I'm going to show how to create a custom tool that will allow us to make several matchsticks or toothpicks easily. So the first thing I'm going to do is go and document options. I want to create a new blank page in order to give us a workspace. First thing I'm going to do is just create any old segment that's going to define the length of the matchstick. And for reasons that I'll explain to you later, I want to label the points. This is going to be the head of my matchstick, and wipe that off. And I will label this one the tail of the matchstick. All right. So I want. Oh, I didn't tell you about this part. When this person asked me, how do I make the matchsticks or toothpicks, in Sketchpad, my first statement was, well, you could just, of course, use segments and explore the problem that way, right? But the problem with using just segments is that they don't all stay the same length, and this might actually cause some problems with certain types of puzzles that require things to be the same length. So this person really wanted to be able to create matchsticks that are the same length. So let me delete these. Now I can go back and talk about the next step. In order to create a bunch of segments that are the same length, or even one segment that's the same length, in geometry, the way that we duplicate lengths is with a compass. So I might, in geometry, I would measure this length with a compass. I would put the pointy part of the compass here and the pencil part of it here in order to measure that length. And then I would come over here and say, okay, I use that length in order to create a circle. And then I can, or even just an arc of a circle, and then I can create a segment that is on that it has that same length. So this is just how I would do it with an actual compass on paper, but of course in Sketchpad that doesn't work because this circle is defined by this point and this point, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the length of that segment. So I'm going to get rid of these and show how to do this in Sketchpad to use this segment to define the radius of the circle. So circles need a center and they need a radius. So what I'm going to do is put here a point that's going to be the center of the circle, and I'm going to use this as the radius. With those two things selected, and only those two things selected, I go to construct circle by center plus radius. And then I have this circle, and I can see that if I change the length of this segment, it changes the radius of the circle. Okay, great. So now I can put a segment in there, and I don't need this circle anymore. I need it to be there, but I need it to not be shown. So I will go to the display menu and say hide circle. And here I have this segment. Remember, this is the center of my circle. So if I drag this point around, then it moves the whole segment. But then if I drag this point, that's the point that's on the circle, so this will allow me to change the orientation. And of course you can see that if I change the length of my original defining segment, then that also changes the length of my new segment. All right, so this is wonderful, and I'm going to go and use all of this. These are all of the pieces of information that I need in order to create a custom tool. So I select those, I go down here and I say create new tool, and I'm going to call this tool a matchstick. And I want to go and show script view. I'm going to, okay, I'm in the arrow. I have the arrow tool selected. And the script view, you can see this gives me basically the script of how that segment was constructed. I started with a head and tail. Those are my defining segments for the length. And then I need another point A, which was the center of that circle. And it shows, you know, I needed a segment between head and tail. I created a circle. I constructed another point on that circle. And I put a segment between the center of the circle and that point on the circle. And now I can use this custom tool with this custom tool selected. Okay. And I need to, this says I need to select a point head and a point tail and then that other point. So I select a point head, select tail, and then that other point, and it gives me another matchstick. Head, tail, and another point, head, tail, and another point. And so I can very quickly create a bunch of matchsticks. But one thing that becomes annoying about this is that every single time I create a new matchstick, I have to select that point head and that point tail, and it's always the same 2 points that I'm selecting there. The point A here that one's always a different point, but the point head and the point tail are always the same point head and the same point tail. So it would be nice to be able to tell Sketchpad, hey, I want the same points always selected for these 2 pieces of given information. And this is the way you do that. I'm going to double click on that and I say click this box that says automatically match sketch object. And what this does is Sketchpad, when I'm running this custom tool, looks at my sketch and asks, is there a point anywhere in the sketch that's labeled head? If so, I'm going to use that as my given information here. And this is actually why I chose to name this point head and this point tail, is because it's helpful to have meaningful names, meaningful labels in this when you're working through this, when you do the automatically match sketch object. Select OK, and now you can see that the point head has moved from the given information into assuming information. So Sketchpad says, well, we already have a point head in the sketch. I'm assuming that there's a point head in the sketch. And now I can also move the point. Oh, I need the arrow tool in order to change that. So I can also drag the point tail into that assuming area. And all I have to give Sketchpad then is the point A, which is the center of the circle. So now let's look at using that custom tool, and all it takes is 1 click to create a new matchstick. And I can easily create a whole bunch. Okay, so now I want to go back here and look at all of these segments that I've created. Notice that I have, if I change my original length, then that changes the length of all of them, which is convenient. And each of these has, I can move it by dragging the segment, or one of the points changes the orientation and one of the points changes the movement. So that's a little annoying that it would be helpful to get some visual cues of which point on the segment does the rotation and which point on the segment does the moving. So that's actually why I chose to make matchsticks instead of toothpicks, because matchsticks have different ends on, there's something different on each end. So what I'm going to do now is actually create a visual change. So head of a matchstick is red, typically. The tail of the matchstick is non-existent, so I'm going to right-click this and say I want that to be dot instead of the medium size. I want it to be dot, and then that one doesn't show up anymore. And while I'm at it, I might as well just change the color. I'm going to select the tail point and the segment. Go to display, color, and I have a tan color, but that's also because I edited my color menu. So if you don't have a tan color, you can go into the other menu. And let me bring my color palette over here. And I can then go through and just, choose a color, create my own color, or I can go into some other menu. Here's a brown. Of course, I don't like that brown. I like to change it a little bit. I want it a little lighter. Okay. And then I have a matchstick that looks like this color. However, I just changed this particular segment, but the custom tool actually has all of the information already built into it. So when I go and construct new matchsticks, well, just because I changed the appearance of a point, and I have the Sketchpad by default is set up to automatically change the styles of newly constructed points. So now these points are tan and tiny, but all of the rest of the matchstick is the same as it was before: blue matchstick and red head. So let me go in here and show script view again, and I can show you how to change that in here. So point B was the point on the circle. This is the head of the matchstick, and that's fine as it is, a medium-sized red point. And so I want to change the segment. This is the stick itself. And I can actually label this. I can label this the stick. And I can label this to, but if I was to label that, I would call it head, and I don't want that to get confused. I'm just going to leave that alone. Okay, so I can change the stick color by right-clicking on it in the script view. And I want this to be, I'm going to just use this brown here, and I will also change the line style and call it thick. And now when I create a new matchstick, look at that. I can create all these matchsticks all I want with just a little click, no effort at all. And the fact that I made the two ends different means that I know that this is the end that moves the matchstick, which I can also do just by dragging the stick itself, and this is the end that changes the orientation. And of course, just to remind you, I can change the lengths of all of those matchsticks by changing the length of my original defining segment. Okay, and since I started with a puzzle, let's go back to the other page. For some reason, I hid my page tabs. Let's bring those back. And we have this puzzle. Move 3 matchsticks to make 2 squares. And I don't know if there are other solutions, but my solution is to take these 2 matchsticks and move them up here. And then this matchstick, I will change it to be horizontal. And I'll put it there, and I have 1 small square and 1 big square.